Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1877, when the hills of the Missouri Ozarks turned crimson and gold, the small settlement of Oakvale, nestled along a tributary of the White River approximately 30 miles southwest of Springfield, became the setting for what local newspapers would later describe as a most peculiar and troubling affair. The story centered around Eleanor Clark, a widow of considerable means who had moved to the area following the death of her husband, a former Union Army officer who had amassed a small fortune in railroad investments after the war. What began as curious whispers among neighbors would ultimately reveal a darkness that many would later claim had always lurked behind the elegant facade of the Clark estate. The mansion, with its ornate Victorian architecture, stood in stark contrast to the humble cabins and farmhouses that populated most of the rugged Ozark landscape of Taney County. According to county records, Eleanor Clark purchased the property in the spring of 1875, 2 years before the strange events that would forever alter the community's perception of the enigmatic widow. The case might have been forgotten entirely were it not for the discovery of a series of journals in 1964, found sealed within a hidden compartment in the ruins of what once was the Clark Mansion. These journals, along with county records, newspaper accounts, and the testimonies of descendants of Oakvale residents, allow us to piece together the disturbing narrative that follows. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not merely what occurred behind the closed doors of the Clark estate, but how an entire community became unwittingly complicit in affairs they would later deny any knowledge of. As we examine the evidence, we must remember that history is often not what was recorded, but what was deliberately omitted from official records. The property that would become known as the Clark Estate had a history that predated the widow's arrival. Originally homesteaded by the Thornton family in 1848, the land changed hands several times before remaining vacant for nearly 3 years prior to Eleanor Clark's purchase. Local lore suggested that the property had been difficult to sell due to its isolation and the unusual configuration of the surrounding hills, which cast the main house in shadow for much of the day, even in summer months. The previous owner, a merchant from Springfield named Harrison Wells, had allegedly abandoned the property after just 8 months of residence, claiming the house was unwelcoming to proper family life. County records indicate he sold the property at a considerable loss. Eleanor Clark arrived in Oakvale in March of 1875, accompanied by her housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, and a small staff. According to the recollections of Walter Simmons, who operated the general store in Oakvale, at that time, the widow's arrival caused quite a stir in the small community. She came in a fine carriage, Simmons noted in a letter to his brother, preserved in the Springfield Historical Society collection, dressed in the latest fashion from St. Louis or perhaps even further east. She purchased supplies with a generosity that bordered on extravagance, paying in gold coins and declining to establish a credit account, as was customary. The widow's background was something of a mystery to the residents of Oakvale. She spoke with what was described as a refined Eastern accent and made occasional references to Philadelphia society, yet seemed reluctant to discuss her past in any detail. What was known, or at least widely accepted, was that her husband had been a colonel in the Union Army who had died some years after the war's end. No children were ever mentioned, nor did any relatives ever visit the estate during her residency. For the first several months after her arrival, Eleanor Clark remained relatively isolated, focusing her attention on extensive renovations to the main house and grounds. Local craftsmen and laborers were hired at wages significantly above the standard rate, creating initial goodwill in a community where such opportunities were rare. The renovations included the addition of a large dining room with an unusual oval table that could reportedly seat 20 people comfortably. It was not until the spring of 1876 that the widow began to integrate herself into the community in earnest. She made a substantial donation to the local church, though she rarely attended services. She established herself as a patron of the small school, providing books and other materials. Most notably, she began to make social calls on the wives of prominent citizens, always arriving with small, thoughtfully selected gifts that demonstrated a disturbing level of knowledge about the recipient's private preferences. Martha Eaton, wife of the local physician, recalled in a letter to her sister that the widow had presented her with a brooch that bore an uncanny resemblance to one her mother had owned, which had been lost years earlier. "I never mentioned such a thing to Mrs. Clark," she wrote, "nor has the subject of my mother's jewelry ever been discussed in her presence. When I remarked on the similarity, she merely smiled and said she had a sense about such things." By the autumn of 1876, Eleanor Clark had established herself as a figure of both fascination and unease in Oakvale. She was unfailingly polite, generous with her considerable resources, and yet there remained something about her that caused discomfort among those who spent time in her presence. The local children developed a habit of crossing to the opposite side of the road when passing the Clark property, though none could articulate exactly why they did so. It was around this time that the widow began to hint at her intention to host social gatherings at her home. In conversations around town, she spoke of her late husband's fondness for entertaining and her desire to create a salon of sorts, even here in the wilderness. The implication that Oakvale was somehow primitive compared to her previous surroundings might have caused offense in other circumstances, but the prospect of elegant social events in a community with few diversions proved too enticing for most to resist. The preparations for these gatherings were extensive and somewhat mysterious. Deliveries to the Clark estate increased dramatically, including items that were unusual for the region, exotic spices, imported wines, and fabrics that had to be specially ordered from St. Louis. More curious were the reports from delivery men of unusual modifications to the interior of the house. Joseph Miller, who transported a shipment of furniture from Springfield, reported that the main dining room had been fitted with heavy velvet curtains that could be drawn to separate the table from the rest of the room, as though for some theatrical purpose. The first invitation was extended in October of 1877, nearly 2.5 years after the widow's arrival in Oakvale. The timing was significant, coming just after the harvest, when the community would traditionally hold various celebrations and social gatherings. The invitation was extended first to Judge William Porter and his wife, widely regarded as the most prominent couple in the area. The judge later recalled that the invitation was delivered personally by Mrs. Clark, who emphasized that this would be the first of many such gatherings designed to elevate the discourse of our little community. The initial dinner party, held on October 15, 1877, included only 5 couples, all from the upper echelon of Oakville society. The evening was, by all accounts preserved in correspondence and journal entries, a resounding success. The food was exceptional, the conversation stimulating, and the widow proved to be an accomplished hostess. If there was anything unusual about the gathering, it was only the elaborate nature of the meal and setting, which seemed more appropriate to a major city than a small Ozark community. Yet there were subtle elements that, in retrospect, might have served as warnings. According to the journal of Rebecca Turner, whose parents attended the dinner, her mother returned home in a state of unusual animation, talking extensively about the evening and the widow's charm. Father, however, she wrote, seemed withdrawn and somewhat troubled. When I inquired if he had not enjoyed himself, he said that it had been a pleasant evening, but then added, "There is something in that woman's eyes that does not match her smile." He would say nothing more on the subject, but I noticed that he sat up late that night, something he rarely does. The second dinner was held just 1 week later, with the same guests in attendance, plus 2 additional couples. This established a pattern that would continue throughout the autumn and into the winter, weekly gatherings that gradually expanded to include more of Oakvale's residents. By December, the guest list had grown to include nearly all of the prominent families in the area. though it was noted that Reverend Harmon and his wife had declined all invitations, citing the Reverend's poor health as the reason. It was during this period that the term endless suppers first appeared in local parlance. The phrase was initially used to describe the seemingly inexhaustible abundance of food and drink at these gatherings, but it soon took on additional meaning as the dinners stretched later and later into the night. Guests often did not return home until the early hours of the morning, yet the next day they would appear remarkably refreshed and eager to discuss the previous evening's events. The winter of 1877-1878 was particularly harsh in the Ozarks, with heavy snowfall and prolonged periods of bitter cold. This natural isolation served to intensify the social importance of the widows' gatherings, which continued without interruption, despite weather that would normally have curtailed such activities. On several occasions, guests arrived through blizzard conditions, displaying a determination that struck some observers as unusual. By January of 1878, a distinct social hierarchy had emerged in Oakvale, centered around the Clark estate. Those who regularly attended the widows' suppers began to display a subtle but noticeable sense of superiority toward those who did not. Conversations would halt when non-attendees approached, and references were made to matters discussed at supper with a conspiratorial air. For a community that had previously prided itself on egalitarian values typical of rural settlements, this development was both unusual and unsettling. The account of Theodore Mills, a blacksmith who had declined invitations to the estate due to what he described as an instinctive wariness, provides insight into this transformation. In a statement given to authorities from Springfield in September 1878, he recalled, "It was as though there were suddenly two Oakvales, those who dined with the widow and those who did not. I observed old friendships cooling without apparent cause, business arrangements being altered to favor those in the widow's circle, and a general shift in the community's character that I found deeply troubling." What exactly transpired during these dinners remains a matter of some conjecture, as accounts vary and many records appear to have been deliberately obscured. However, the journal of Rebecca Turner, who began to accompany her parents to the gatherings in February 1878, provides the most comprehensive first-hand account available. According to Rebecca's entries, the pattern of the evenings followed a consistent structure. Guests would arrive at sundown and be served aperitifs in the main parlor, where conversation was generally light and focused on local affairs. Dinner would be served approximately 1 hour later, commencing with a toast proposed by the widow that became increasingly elaborate and esoteric as the months progressed. The meal itself typically consisted of 7 courses, each more exotic than would be expected in such a remote location. Rebecca noted that despite the abundance of food, she often found herself strangely unsatisfied, as though the sustenance provided nourishment for something other than ordinary hunger. This curious phrasing appears repeatedly in her journal, suggesting that she perceived something unusual about the dining experience itself. Following the meal, guests would retire to a drawing room where Eleanor Clark would initiate what she called our evening's true purpose, discussions that Rebecca described as probing beyond the boundaries of conventional discourse. The exact nature of these discussions evolved over time, but they appear to have focused increasingly on personal experiences of loss, fear, desire, and other intimate emotional states. Rebecca's entry from March 10, 1878, provides a particularly revealing glimpse. Mrs. Clark guided the conversation tonight toward the subject of regret. She inquired of each guest in turn about actions they had taken that they wished they could undo, decisions that haunted them. The responses began somewhat superficially, but as the evening progressed, the revelations became startlingly intimate. Judge Porter spoke of a ruling he had made that sent a young man to prison, where he later died of fever. Mrs. Eaton confessed to a long-standing resentment of her sister that had led her to destroy a prized possession out of spite. It was as though some barrier had been removed, allowing words to flow that would normally remain carefully contained. The widow's role in these sessions appears to have been that of a facilitator or guide, asking questions that led guests deeper into self-revelation while sharing very little about herself. Rebecca noted that Mrs. Clark would often observe the speakers with an intensity that seemed at odds with her outwardly sympathetic demeanor. "She watches rather than listens," Rebecca wrote in April, "as though the words themselves are of less interest to her than some reaction they produce in the speaker." As winter gave way to spring, the nature of the gatherings subtly shifted. The dinners themselves became less elaborate, while the discussions that followed grew increasingly ritualized. Guests were encouraged to participate in what the widow referred to as exercises in trust and solidarity that, based on Rebecca's descriptions, appear to have been designed to break down normal social boundaries. One such exercise, described in an entry from May 1878, involved guests being paired and instructed to maintain eye contact in silence for extended periods. "It created the most peculiar sensation," Rebecca wrote, "a feeling of falling into the other person while simultaneously being invaded. Afterward, I felt I knew things about Mr. Wilson, a local merchant, that he had never spoken aloud, and I was certain he had similar insights about me." When I mentioned this to Mother later, she seemed confused and claimed no such activity had occurred. This last observation points to another disturbing aspect of the gatherings, the apparent discrepancy between what Rebecca recorded and what other participants later recalled. These inconsistencies became more pronounced as the spring progressed, with Rebecca frequently noting that her parents and others denied or minimized elements of the evenings that she found most unsettling. By early summer, Rebecca's journal entries reflect growing concern about her own perceptions. "I find myself questioning my recollection of events," she wrote in June. "Last night, I am certain that Mrs. Bryant became so distressed during one of the widow's exercises that she began to sob uncontrollably and had to be led from the room by Mrs. Winters. Yet today, when I inquired after her well-being, she looked at me blankly and said she had enjoyed a pleasant evening with no disturbance of any kind." Mother, too, insisted that Mrs. Bryant had been in good spirits throughout. "Am I losing my grasp on reality, or is there some collective agreement to reshape the truth?" The summer months brought additional disturbing developments. The widow began to select certain guests for what she termed private consultations following the general gatherings. These individuals would remain at the estate after others had departed, sometimes staying until dawn. Those chosen for these extensions displayed a marked change in demeanor in subsequent days, a detachment from normal concerns and relationships that many in the community found alarming. Sheriff Thomas Braddock was among those selected for these private sessions in early July. His deputy, James Miller, noted in a personal letter that the sheriff's behavior changed noticeably afterward. "He speaks of the widow with a reverence that borders on devotion," Miller wrote to his brother in St. Louis. "Yesterday, he reprimanded me sharply for making inquiries about unusual sounds reported at the Clark property, saying that the widow's privacy must be respected above all other concerns. This from a man who has built his reputation on thorough investigation of any potential disturbance." The disappearance of Samuel Jenkins in late July marked a significant escalation. Jenkins, a skilled carpenter who had worked extensively on the Clark estate, was last seen entering the property on the evening of July 27th to address what was described as an urgent repair. His wife reported him missing the following morning when he failed to return home. The official investigation, conducted by Deputy Miller in Sheriff Braddock's absence, the sheriff having been called away to Springfield on unspecified business, was perfunctory at best. Mrs. Clark stated that Jenkins had completed the work and departed around midnight, mentioning an intention to visit relatives in a neighboring county. This explanation was accepted despite the fact that Jenkins had left his tools at the worksite and had not informed his wife of any such plans. Lydia Jenkins, in a statement that was subsequently removed from official records but preserved in Deputy Miller's personal papers, expressed serious concerns about her husband's state of mind in the days preceding his disappearance. He had been working at the Clark house for several weeks, she reported, and had begun to sleep poorly, waking in the night, speaking of rooms that shouldn't exist and sounds that have no source. The morning before he disappeared, he told me he had decided to refuse any further work at the estate, saying, "There are things happening in that house that decent folk shouldn't be party to." He would not elaborate, saying only that the less I knew, the safer I would be. No trace of Samuel Jenkins was ever found, nor was there any confirmation of his arrival at the relative's home where he had supposedly been headed. The case was officially closed in August when Sheriff Braddock declared that Jenkins had likely moved on to seek opportunities elsewhere, a conclusion that satisfied few in the community but was not openly challenged. By August 1878, the atmosphere in Oakvale had become increasingly strained. The divide between those who attended the widows' gatherings and those who did not had deepened into something approaching hostility. Several businesses reported losing customers who had shifted their patronage to establishments owned by members of the widows' circle. The local church saw a decline in attendance, with many of the widows' regular guests citing ill health or prior commitments as reasons for their absence. Reverend Harmon, who had consistently declined invitations to the Clark estate, began to speak out against what he termed unwholesome influences in the community, though he never mentioned the widow by name. His August 12th sermon, preserved in his personal papers, warned against those who would lead us away from righteous paths through the seduction of worldly pleasures and forbidden knowledge. Following this sermon, the Reverend reported receiving anonymous threats and finding his church door marked with a strange symbol one morning, a circle containing what appeared to be an inverted triangle. The widow's behavior also changed during this period. Her appearances in town became less frequent, and when she did venture out, witnesses described her as appearing feverishly animated, speaking rapidly, and touching those she conversed with in a manner that many found intrusive. On several occasions, she was observed studying individuals who had declined her invitations with an intensity that left them deeply uncomfortable. The most significant public incident occurred in late August when Eleanor Clark encountered Reverend Harmon outside the general store. According to multiple witnesses, she approached him with unusual directness and said, "Your resistance only makes the eventual surrender more profound, Reverend. There will be a place for you at my table before the harvest moon." When Harmon responded that he would never set foot in her home, she reportedly laughed in a manner described as entirely devoid of mirth and replied, "The choice will not be yours to make when the time comes. This confrontation, occurring as it did in full view of several townspeople, marked a turning point in how the wider community perceived the widow. Even some who had been regular attendees at her gatherings began to express reservations, though few went so far as to decline subsequent invitations. Rebecca Turner's journal entries from this period reflect a growing sense of dread and inevitability. "I feel as though we are all being drawn toward some terrible conclusion," she wrote in late August. Each week the conversations at the widow's table venture further into territories that should remain unexplored. Last night she spoke of boundaries between states of being that can be crossed through certain rituals of shared experience. Her eyes seemed to glow as she described the dissolution of individual identity into something collective and transcendent. I find myself both repelled and inexplicably drawn by these discussions, as though some part of me recognizes a terrible truth in her words while another part recoils from it. The discovery of the hidden chamber in early September 1878 precipitated the crisis that would ultimately lead to the widow's apparent downfall. Following several days of heavy rain, a section of hillside behind the Clark mansion collapsed, revealing what appeared to be a recently excavated space cut into the limestone bedrock. Caleb Foster, whose family farm adjoined the Clark property, made the discovery while checking fence lines damaged by the rain. His decision to report his findings to Reverend Harmon rather than Sheriff Braddock proved crucial to subsequent events. Harmon, having long harbored suspicions about activities at the Clark estate, immediately contacted authorities in Springfield rather than notifying local law enforcement. The initial investigation of the exposed chamber was conducted by Marshal William Tate and 2 deputies from Springfield, accompanied by Reverend Harmon. The official report, filed on September 7, 1878, is notable for its vagueness regarding what was found. It mentions only evidence of activities, inconsistent with normal social gatherings, and items of a concerning nature that suggest possible harm to individuals. The report concludes with a recommendation for immediate further investigation by county authorities. What the official documentation fails to include, but what is revealed in the private correspondence of Marshal Tate to the circuit judge, is a more detailed accounting of the chamber's contents. According to this letter, preserved in the judge's personal papers, the space contained a circular arrangement of 13 chairs surrounding a central stone table or altar. The walls were covered with writings described as reminiscent of personal confessions, recorded in multiple hands. Most disturbing were references to vessels of transformation and what appeared to be a detailed schedule of future gatherings, with certain dates marked with red symbols. Based on this evidence, a warrant was issued for Eleanor Clark's arrest on charges that included conspiracy to commit acts against the public welfare, a notably vague accusation that suggests the authorities themselves were uncertain how to categorize what they had discovered. The arrest was carried out on the evening of September 8, 1878. As guests were arriving for what the widow had described in her invitations as a gathering of special significance, the scene that unfolded during the arrest, as described by Deputy Marshal Simmons in a letter to his wife, suggests the hold that Eleanor Clark had established over many in the community. As we approached the house with our warrant, he wrote, we were confronted by several prominent citizens of Oakvale who attempted to prevent our entry. Judge Porter himself stood on the porch and declared that we had no authority to disturb a private social gathering. It was only when Marshal Tate presented the circuit judge's order that they reluctantly stepped aside. The widow herself showed no surprise at our arrival. Indeed, she smiled as though she had been expecting us and said, "You are simply early guests for our final communion." I confess that her manner caused me considerable unease. The search of the mansion that followed revealed additional disturbing elements not included in official reports. According to Deputy Simmons's personal account, the dining room had been elaborately prepared for what appeared to be a ceremony rather than a normal dinner. The oval table was covered with a black cloth on which unfamiliar symbols had been embroidered in red thread. At each place setting was a small silver cup containing a dark liquid that was never officially identified. Most concerning was the discovery of what Simmons described as a ledger of transformations in the widow's private study. This document, which was confiscated but does not appear in any evidence inventory, allegedly contained detailed observations of changes in the behavior and thought patterns of regular dinner guests, with particular attention to the erosion of boundaries between self and collective. The aftermath of the arrest was characterized by confusion and an apparent effort by local authorities to minimize the significance of what had occurred. Eleanor Clark was initially held in the Oakvale jail, but within 48 hours she had been transferred to Springfield under circumstances that remain unclear. Sheriff Braddock, who had returned to town upon news of the arrest, reportedly objected strenuously to the removal of the prisoner from his jurisdiction, going so far as to suggest that the charges were entirely without merit. The expected legal proceedings never materialized in any formal sense. Court records from September 1878 include a brief notation regarding a closed hearing before the circuit judge, after which it was determined that Eleanor Clark should be remanded to the state asylum in St. Louis for evaluation of her mental condition. There is no record of any subsequent criminal charges or trial. The reaction in Oakvale to these events was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair. Rather than the expected shock or concern, the prevailing response among many residents, particularly those who had been regular attendees at the widow's gatherings, was one of denial and disinterest. When questioned by authorities from Springfield, Many claimed to have no specific recollection of the activities that had taken place at the Clark estate, describing the gatherings as ordinary social events, despite evidence to the contrary. Even more striking was the apparent collective agreement not to discuss the matter once the widow had been removed. The local newspaper made no mention of the arrest or the discoveries at the property beyond a brief notice about the upcoming auction of the estate. In personal correspondence and journals from the period, the subject is conspicuously absent, as though the entire community had tacitly agreed to erase Eleanor Clark from their collective memory. Rebecca Turner's journal provides the most insightful commentary on this strange aftermath. "It is as though a fog has descended over Oakvale," she wrote in late September. "People move through their daily routines with a mechanical quality, avoiding any mention of the widow or her gatherings. When I attempted to discuss the matter with Mother yesterday, she looked at me with such vacancy that I momentarily wondered if she recognized me. Father spends hours staring at nothing, his medical practice increasingly neglected. I alone seem to remember clearly what transpired over those many months, and I find myself questioning whether this clarity is a blessing or a curse. The official record indicates that Eleanor Clark died at the state asylum on November 23, 1878, just weeks after her admission. The cause of death is listed as failure of the heart, a diagnosis common enough in the period to raise no particular questions. She was reportedly buried in the asylum cemetery in an unmarked grave, as was standard practice for patients without family to claim the remains. Yet evidence suggests that the widow's story did not end with this convenient death certificate. On December 15, 1878, land records in Forsyth, Missouri, approximately 40 miles south of Oakvale, show the purchase of a substantial property by a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a woman whose description in local accounts bears a striking resemblance to Eleanor Clark. By spring of 1879, this widow had established herself in the community and had begun to host elaborate dinner parties for prominent local families. The pattern that followed is documented across multiple communities in the Ozarks over the subsequent decade. A widow of means would establish residence, begin hosting increasingly elaborate and frequent social gatherings, and eventually become the center of some unspecified scandal, after which she would disappear only to reemerge elsewhere under a slightly altered name. Galena in 1881 saw the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwell, whose dinner parties became the talk of the county until her abrupt departure following what local records cryptically refer to as unfortunate discoveries at the estate. In West Plains in 1883, Mrs. Eliza Clark established a similar pattern before disappearing amid rumors of unwholesome practices. Finally, in Branson in 1887, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood Clark created what was described in a local church record as a cult of personality, centered around elaborate ritualistic gatherings before authorities were alerted to unusual activities on her property. In each location, the aftermath followed a similar pattern to that observed in Oakvale, a curious reluctance among former guests to discuss specific activities, a collective minimizing of events, and an apparent determination to forget what had transpired. Also consistent was the discovery of some form of underground or hidden space associated with the property, though detailed descriptions of these discoveries are notably absent from official records. The final confirmed sighting of a woman believed to be Eleanor Clark comes from a hotel register in Springfield dated October 1889. After this, the trail goes cold. No death record has ever been located under any of her known aliases, nor is there evidence of her establishing residence elsewhere in the region. The true nature of what occurred at these endless suppers remains a matter of speculation. The physical evidence discovered at the Oakvale estate and subsequent properties was either deliberately obscured in official records or lost to time. What we are left with are fragments, journal entries, personal correspondence, and the suspicious gaps in official documentation that often tell us more than what was actually recorded. Various theories have emerged over the years regarding Eleanor Clark's motives and methods. Some suggest that she was practicing a form of psychological manipulation or amateur hypnosis, techniques that were gaining popularity in certain circles during the period. The structured nature of her gatherings, the progressive deepening of personal revelations, and the reported memory discrepancies among participants all align with documented techniques of coercive influence. Others propose more mundane explanations, suggesting that she may have been dispensing mind-altering substances to her guests, perhaps as part of some misguided experiment in social control. The presence of the small silver cups noted by Deputy Simmons lends some credence to this theory, though no chemical analysis was ever recorded in official documents. The most troubling theory, and the one that best accounts for the community's subsequent silence, is that the widow's guests became unwitting participants in activities so contrary to their self-image and social standing that they chose collective denial rather than acknowledgement. The exposed chambers at each property, the items removed from the mansions, the careful selection and grooming of participants all suggest a calculated effort to draw people into behaviors they would normally find unthinkable. What makes the case of the widow Clark and her endless suppers so disturbing is not just what might have occurred behind closed doors, but how easily entire communities could be gradually led to complicity. The social pressure to attend, the subtle isolation of those who refused, the apparent forgetting described by Rebecca Turner, these elements suggest a form of collective manipulation that proved remarkably effective across multiple communities over a decade. In 1964, when construction workers uncovered the remains of the original Clark Mansion Foundation in Oakvale while clearing land for a new development, they discovered a sealed copper box containing the journals that form the primary source for this account. Along with the journals were several photographs, various newspaper clippings related to the other communities where the widow had established residence, and a single dinner invitation ornately printed. From September 1878, the very week of Eleanor Clark's apparent arrest. The invitation reads, "Mrs. Eleanor Clark requests the pleasure of your company for a special gathering to commemorate the conclusion of our shared endeavors. Attendance is imperative. No record exists of whether this final supper ever took place. The events of September 8, 1878, presumably prevented it. Yet the wording, 'the conclusion of our shared endeavors,' suggests that whatever transpired during those months of endless suppers was building toward some culmination that was interrupted by the discovery of the hidden chamber." Among the items found in the copper box was a small notebook apparently belonging to Eleanor Clark herself, though its authenticity has been questioned by some historians. The entries, spanning from 1874 to 1878, are sparse and often cryptic, but they suggest a methodical approach to what the writer referred to as the work of dissolution and reformation. One entry, dated January 1877, reads, "The isolation of these hills serves my purpose well. Far from prying eyes, I can proceed without the interference that hampered previous attempts. The people here are simpler than those in Philadelphia, their hunger for refinement and novelty making them receptive to influence. I have identified 17 potential vessels in Oakvale. The preparatory phase begins in autumn. A later entry from June 1878 is even more disturbing. Progress exceeds expectations. The boundary erosion in subjects P, E, and B is nearly complete. They now accept guidance without question and have begun to influence others as anticipated. The resistance from subject H, presumably Reverend Harmon, is unfortunate but not unexpected. Such opposition often strengthens the cohesion of the primary group. The final communion must occur before the first frost. The vessel is nearly prepared. What exactly Eleanor Clark meant by these references remains unclear. The notebook contains no explicit description of her ultimate goal or the specific nature of the communion she anticipated. However, a final entry dated September 6, 1878, just 2 days before her arrest, suggests a sense of impending achievement. All is in readiness. The 17 have been reduced to the essential 13. The boundary between individual and collective has thinned to translucence. What was many shall become one, and what is one shall be many. The work of centuries comes to fruition in these hills. In 1968, Dr. Lawrence Harrison, a psychiatrist with an interest in historical cases of mass influence, published a paper suggesting that Eleanor Clark may have been practicing an early form of what we now recognize as coercive control, systematically breaking down individuals' sense of reality and autonomy through manipulation of their social environment and perceptions. He noted the similarity between the techniques described in the Turner journals and those documented in certain cults and totalitarian regimes. Harrison proposed that the widow's endless suppers functioned as a form of ritualized conditioning, with each gathering designed to incrementally shift participants' perceptions and lower their resistance to suggestion. The shared meals, the late hours, the progressive intensification of personal revelations, and the reported memory discrepancies all align with known methods of psychological manipulation. Most disturbing was Harrison's suggestion that the ultimate goal may have been the creation of what he termed a collective identity subordinate to the controller. Essentially, the systematic erasure of individual autonomy in favor of a group consciousness, directed by Eleanor Clark herself. The references in her notebook to vessels, boundary erosion, and the transformation of many into one support this unsettling interpretation. What remains perhaps most unsettling about the case is how little official acknowledgement it received, despite affecting multiple communities and involving dozens, perhaps hundreds of people over a decade. The story of the widow Clark exists primarily in personal accounts, journals, and correspondence rather than in official histories, as though the collective agreement to forget extended beyond the immediate participants to society at large. The site of the original Clark mansion in Oakvale remained undeveloped after the 1964 discovery. Local resistance to building on the property was strong, though few would articulate exactly why. In 1967, the land was designated as a county nature preserve, effectively ensuring it would remain undisturbed. A similar pattern emerged in the other communities where the widow had established residence. In Forsyth, the property remained vacant until it was destroyed by fire in 1923. In Galena, the land was incorporated into a cemetery, with the mansion deliberately demolished. In West Plains and Branson, the properties were eventually developed, but local accounts suggest that the buildings erected there were plagued by unusual occurrences that led to multiple abandonments. Today, hikers on the Oakvale Preserve occasionally report an unusual sense of disquiet in the vicinity of the old foundation, particularly around dusk. Park rangers attribute this to natural features of the landscape, the way sound carries in the hollow, the particular quality of light as the sun sets behind the ridge. Perhaps they are right, or perhaps something of Eleanor Clark's influence lingers in that quiet corner of the Ozarks, a reminder of how easily the veneer of civilization can be manipulated, how readily people can be led to participate in their own undoing, and how completely a community can choose to forget what it finds too disturbing to acknowledge. The journals of Rebecca Turner, now preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archive, end with an entry dated December 1, 1878. Nearly 3 months after the widow's apparent removal to the asylum, I dreamt of Mrs. Clark last night. In the dream, she sat at the head of her long dining table, though she was alone. She looked up as though sensing my presence and smiled. "There will always be a place for you," she said. "The supper never truly ends." I woke with such a sense of dread that I could not return to sleep. Even now, writing by lamplight, I feel as though someone is standing just behind me, reading over my shoulder, waiting for me to accept an invitation I never received. Rebecca Turner died in 1901 at the age of 42. The cause of death was listed as nervous exhaustion, another vague diagnosis common to the era. According to family accounts, in her final years, she refused all dinner invitations and would not allow food to be served at a table in her presence, preferring to take her meals standing by a window where she could watch the road leading to her house. The historical record provides little information about what became of the other residents of Oakvale who had been regular attendees at the widow's gatherings. Judge Porter resigned his position in 1879 and relocated to Kansas City, where he reportedly lived as a recluse until his death in 1884. Dr. Eaton's medical practice gradually declined, and he was found dead in his office in 1882, apparently having ingested a lethal dose of laudanum. Sheriff Braddock remained in his position until 1880, when he failed to return from what was described as a routine patrol. His body was discovered 3 days later near the ruins of the Clark estate, with no obvious cause of death. Other former guests displayed similar patterns of decline or unexplained behavior in the years following the widow's departure. Several committed suicide, while others simply vanished from the community without explanation. By 1885, almost none of the families who had been part of the widow's circle remained in Oakvale. The community itself began to fade, and by the turn of the century, it had been largely abandoned, with most residents relocating to larger towns in the region. What is perhaps most remarkable about these subsequent events is how little connection was made at the time between the widow's influence and the fates of her former guests. Newspaper accounts of the various deaths and disappearances treat each as an isolated tragedy rather than part of a pattern. Even those who must have been aware of the common factor, regular attendance at the Clark estate, appear to have been unable or unwilling to acknowledge the connection. This pattern of disconnection and denial extended to the other communities where the widow established herself. In each location, similar aftermaths unfolded: the gradual decline of former guests, unexplained deaths or disappearances, and a collective reluctance to recognize any pattern in these events. It was as though the widow left behind a legacy of fragmentation, a community-wide inability to connect cause and effect when it came to her influence. The question that haunts this case is not just what Eleanor Clark's ultimate purpose might have been, but how she was able to extend her influence across multiple communities and over many years without facing significant opposition or exposure. The isolated nature of Ozark communities in the late 19th century certainly facilitated her activities, but there seems to have been something more at work, a kind of blindness that affected not just her immediate victims, but the broader society around them. Dr. Harrison, in his 1968 analysis, suggested that this blindness might itself have been part of Clark's methodology. The most effective form of control, he wrote, is that which renders itself invisible. By creating a shared experience that participants subsequently denied or minimized, the controller establishes a pattern of reality distortion that extends beyond specific events to a general state of disconnection from objective truth. In other words, the very act of collectively forgetting or denying what occurred at the endless suppers created a state of cognitive vulnerability that persisted long after the widow had moved on. Those who had participated became unreliable narrators of their own experience, unable to recognize connections or patterns that might have alerted them to ongoing danger. This interpretation is supported by the curious fact that in each community where the widow established herself, there were always a few individuals who recognized the threat she posed and attempted to raise alarms. Reverend Harmon in Oakvale, a school teacher in Forsyth, a newspaper editor in Galena. Yet these voices were consistently marginalized or dismissed, often by the very authorities who should have been most responsive to their concerns. In 1955, construction workers renovating an old building in Springfield discovered a small metal box concealed within a wall cavity. The box contained a single document, a letter, addressed to any who might understand. Dated October 1889 and signed simply E.C., the letter has been authenticated as being written in the same hand as the notebook found in Oakvale, presumably that of Eleanor Clark herself. The content of the letter is disturbing in its clarity and apparent sincerity. It reads in part, The work continues, though I find myself increasingly limited by the constraints of this physical form. Each communion brings me closer to the ultimate dissolution, yet the process remains incomplete. The vessels prepared thus far have served their purpose, but the final transformation eludes me. Perhaps it is not to be achieved in this generation. If so, I shall ensure that the knowledge is preserved for those who come after. What has been set in motion in these hills cannot be undone. The boundaries once breached cannot be restored. In time, all will come to the table. The letter concludes with a series of symbols similar to those reported on the dinner table at the time of the widow's arrest in Oakvale, followed by the phrase, "Look for me in the hunger that cannot be satisfied, in the emptiness that persists despite abundance. I am the space between those who gather but remain apart. I am the silence that falls when truth approaches." Until the final communion, I remain ever watching, ever waiting. This document, with its suggestion of some purpose extending beyond the widow's own lifetime, adds a particularly disturbing dimension to the case. Was Eleanor Clark merely a disturbed individual with an unusual talent for manipulation, or was she part of something larger, some tradition or movement that viewed her activities as part of a long-term project spanning generations? Certain elements of the case suggest the latter possibility. The systematic nature of her approach, the consistency of her methods across different communities, and the references in her writings to the work of centuries all imply a framework extending beyond her individual initiative. Yet no evidence has ever emerged linking her to any identified group or tradition, either before her appearance in the Ozarks or after her disappearance. In the decades following these events, occasional reports emerged from various communities in the Ozarks of similar patterns, a charismatic newcomer establishing exclusive social gatherings that gradually transformed the dynamics of the community. None of these cases progressed to the apparent extremes of the Eleanor Clark incidents, perhaps because improved communication and transportation in the region made such isolation more difficult to maintain. The last such report came from a small community near Table Rock Lake in 1964. The same year the journals were discovered in Oakvale. A woman identifying herself as Eleanor Blackwood Clark purchased property and began hosting what were described as philosophical dinner parties for selected residents. Following the publication of Dr. Harrison's paper in 1968, which included photographs believed to be of the original Eleanor Clark, a local resident made the connection and alerted authorities. By the time they investigated, the woman had disappeared, leaving behind a fully set dining table, but no other trace of her presence. The question of whether this could have been the same individual who had begun her activities nearly a century earlier is, of course, implausible. Yet the deliberate adoption of the name and methods suggests either an extraordinary coincidence, or some form of conscious continuation, perhaps a disciple, or someone who had discovered the widow's writings and chosen to emulate her approach. What makes this final incident particularly unsettling is that it occurred in the same year that the original journals were discovered, suggesting a possible connection between the revelation of the historical case and this apparent reenactment. Was someone attempting to revive whatever work Eleanor Clark had been engaged in? Or was it simply a macabre form of historical role play, a disturbed individual finding inspiration in a century-old case? No definitive answer has emerged, and no similar incidents have been reported in the region since. The Table Rock Lake property, like so many others associated with this case, remained vacant for years before being purchased by a development company in the 1980s. The house was demolished and vacation cabins were built on the site. Visitors occasionally report an unusual atmosphere in the area, particularly around the location where the main house once stood, but such accounts are easily dismissed as the product of suggestion and local folklore. The legacy of Eleanor Clark and her endless suppers persists, primarily as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of isolated communities to manipulation and the human capacity for denial when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The mechanisms she employed, the exploitation of social hierarchy, The gradual normalization of boundary violations, the creation of artificial scarcity around inclusion are recognizable patterns in many contexts of coercive control, from abusive relationships to destructive cults. What distinguishes this case is the apparent absence of any clear motive beyond the exercise of influence itself. Unlike many manipulators who seek financial gain, sexual exploitation, or political power, Eleanor Clark seems to have been driven by some purpose that remained obscure even to those closest to her activities. The references in her writings to dissolution, transformation, and communion suggest a quasi-spiritual objective, but the specific nature of this goal remains elusive. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the influence itself was the purpose, that the progressive erosion of her guests' autonomy and their increasing dependence on her guidance was not a means to some further end, but the objective itself. In this interpretation, Eleanor Clark was not preparing her vessels for some ultimate transformation, but rather deriving satisfaction from the very process of manipulation, from watching the gradual surrender of individual will to her direction. This would align with what modern psychology recognizes as the motivational patterns of certain personality types, who view others not as autonomous beings but as extensions of themselves, sources of what psychologists term narcissistic supply. The detailed observations in her notebook, the apparent pleasure she took in witnessing emotional distress, and the methodical progression of her manipulations all suggest this possibility. Yet this psychological interpretation fails to account for certain elements of the case. The underground chambers, the ritualistic aspects of the gatherings, the references to ancient traditions, and most significantly, the apparent reappearance of her methods across decades and in multiple locations. These factors suggest something more structured and persistent than individual pathology, though what exactly that might be remains unclear. In 2003, an archaeological survey of the Oakvale site, conducted as part of a broader study of 19th-century settlements in the Ozarks, made a discovery that added yet another layer to the mystery. Using ground-penetrating radar, researchers identified what appeared to be a network of tunnels extending from the foundation of the main house to several locations on the property, including an area beneath what would have been the stable and another connecting to the hillside chamber discovered in 1878. Limited excavation revealed that these tunnels had been carefully constructed and reinforced, suggesting considerable investment of resources. More disturbing was the discovery that the network appeared to extend beyond the boundaries of the Clark property, with one passage heading in the direction of the former location of Judge Porter's home approximately half a mile away. Permission for further excavation was denied by county authorities, who cited concerns about the stability of the hillside and potential damage to the nature preserve. Critics suggested that the real motivation was a reluctance to uncover evidence that might substantiate the more disturbing aspects of the Eleanor Clark case, particularly the possible involvement of prominent historical figures in the region. The question of who exactly Eleanor Clark was remains similarly unresolved. Despite extensive research by historians interested in the case, no conclusive evidence has been found linking her to any Eleanor Clark or a similar name in Philadelphia or elsewhere. Prior to her appearance in Oakvale in 1875, it's as though she emerged fully formed in the Ozarks with no verifiable past, a circumstance that would have been difficult to maintain in more connected communities, but was entirely possible in the isolated hills of post-Civil War Missouri. Some researchers have suggested that Eleanor Clark may itself have been an assumed identity, perhaps adopted after the individual's involvement in some scandal or criminal activity elsewhere. The period following the Civil War was one of considerable social disruption, with many people reinventing themselves as they relocated to new regions. The widow's apparent wealth, however, suggests either a substantial criminal enterprise or a legitimate background of some kind. As such, resources would have been difficult to obtain through deception alone in that era. The most intriguing theory, proposed by historian Margaret Wilson in her 1997 book, The Forgotten Darkness, is that Eleanor Clark may have been connected to certain esoteric societies that flourished in the northeastern United States in the mid-19th century. Wilson points to similarities between the practices described in the Turner journals and rituals documented in the private papers of several such groups, particularly those focused on what they termed the transcendence of individual consciousness. While speculative, this theory would account for the widow's apparent education and refinement, her financial resources, and most significantly, the structured nature of her approach to the endless suppers. It might also explain the references in her writings to the work of centuries and what has been set in motion, phrases that suggest participation in a tradition rather than individual innovation. The absence of conclusive evidence regarding Eleanor Clark's identity and motivations is itself revealing. In an era when record-keeping was becoming increasingly systematic, the ability to maintain such obscurity suggests either extraordinary care in concealing one's past or the assistance of others in doing so. Either possibility adds to the disturbing implications of the case that the widow's activities in the Ozarks may have been part of something larger and more organized than the actions of a single disturbed individual. What can be stated with certainty is that between 1875 and 1889, something unusual occurred in several communities across the Missouri Ozarks, centered around a woman who used social gatherings as a means of exerting profound influence over those who attended. The effects of this influence extended well beyond the period of her presence, shaping the subsequent history of these communities and the lives of those who had participated in her endless suppers. The legacy of this case lies not just in its historical curiosity, but in what it reveals about human vulnerability to manipulation, particularly in contexts where isolation and limited perspectives create fertile ground for coercive influence. The methods attributed to Eleanor Clark, the exploitation of social hunger, the gradual normalization of boundary violations, the creation of selective memory, and shared denial, are recognizable patterns that continue to emerge in various contexts of manipulation and control. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is what it suggests about our collective capacity for forgetting. The apparent ease with which entire communities could be led to deny or minimize disturbing experiences, to disconnect cause from effect, and to isolate rather than integrate. Threatening information represents a vulnerability that extends beyond the specific historical context of the Ozarks in the 1870s and 1880s. Some wounds never heal. Some stories never fully end. And some suppers, it seems, continue long after the guests have departed and the hostess has vanished into the mists of history. In the quiet hills of the Ozarks, where the past seems always just around the next bend in the road, perhaps Eleanor Clark still waits, setting her table for guests who have long since returned to dust. As you drive through the winding roads of the Ozarks today, passing old homesteads and forgotten communities, consider this: not all invitations should be accepted. Not all hospitality comes without cost, and sometimes the most dangerous table is the one where everyone insists nothing unusual ever happened. In 2018, a developer planning a luxury resort near the former site of the Branson property, once owned by Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood Clark, reported an unusual discovery during preliminary excavation. Workers uncovered what appeared to be the remains of a circular stone structure approximately 12 feet in diameter, located beneath what would have been the dining room of the original house. At the center of this structure was a stone table, and arranged around it were 13 niches cut into the surrounding walls, each sized to accommodate what one worker described as something about the size of a bread box. The developer, citing concerns about project delays, declined to permit archaeological investigation of the site and proceeded with construction after filling in the discovered chamber with concrete. When questioned about this decision, he reportedly stated that the structure was probably just an old root cellar or storage area, and that digging up the past never did anybody any good. Local historians and researchers interested in the Eleanor Clark case attempted to secure a court order to halt construction pending proper documentation of the site. But legal proceedings moved too slowly to prevent the destruction of whatever evidence might have been preserved there. By the time a temporary injunction was granted, the area had been completely rebuilt, effectively sealing whatever remained of the original structure beneath tons of concrete and steel. This pattern of discovery, followed by denial, concealment, or destruction, has characterized many of the sites associated with Eleanor Clark and her activities. Whether motivated by practical concerns, superstition, or some deeper unease about what might be revealed, the consistent effect has been to maintain the obscurity that surrounds this case, preserving its mysteries while preventing conclusive investigation. In this regard, the story of the widow Clark and her endless suppers remains unfinished, a narrative with clear beginnings but no definitive ending, a case that resists closure or complete understanding. Like the guests who departed her table with fragmented memories and a reluctance to acknowledge what had transpired, we are left with partial glimpses of a reality that remains just beyond the reach of full comprehension. Perhaps this is fitting. Some influences persist precisely because they resist clear definition or categorical understanding. Some mysteries endure because their resolution would require us to confront aspects of human nature and social dynamics that we prefer to leave unexamined. And some tables remain set, waiting for guests who might not recognize the invitation for what it is until they have already taken their seats. As Rebecca Turner wrote in her final journal entry, "The supper never truly ends." In the quiet hills of the Ozarks, in communities built over the foundations of houses long demolished, in the subtle pressures of social inclusion and exclusion that continue to shape human behavior, perhaps Eleanor Clark's legacy continues, not as a ghost or supernatural presence, but as a pattern of influence that, once established, perpetuates itself through the very human vulnerabilities it was designed to exploit. The next time you receive an invitation that seems too enticing to refuse, consider the story of the endless suppers. Consider what might be served beyond the food itself, what hunger might be exploited beyond the physical, and what table you might be joining that extends far beyond the immediate gathering. For in the end, the most dangerous invitation is not the one that threatens immediate harm, but the one that offers a place in something that gradually transforms you into someone who would never have accepted the invitation in the first place.